If a man who owns nothing gives away his last $5, does that make him poor or the richest soul in the entire city? The subway station beneath Manhattan hummed with the tired rhythm of a late evening. A train roared through the tunnel like distant thunder, pushing a rush of cold wind along the tiled platform. Near a concrete pillar stood a thin man with a weathered guitar and a worn brown coat that had seen too many winters. His name was Ethan Cole. Most people walking past him never learned that name. To them, he was only another shadow in the underground city, another homeless musician playing soft melodies for loose change. His fingers moved gently across the strings, sending a quiet tune through the echoing station. The melody floated above the rumble of trains and the hurried footsteps of commuters rushing home after long days of work. Some people glanced at him. A few dropped coins into the open guitar case at his feet. Most simply walked by without seeing him at all. Ethan did not blame them. Cities like New York train people to look forward and keep moving. Still, music was the one thing that reminded him he was still alive. As he played, he noticed something unusual across the platform. A woman sat alone on a cold metal bench with her head lowered into her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Her dark hair partly covered her face, and her coat looked too thin for the bitter underground draft. Several people walked past her, but none stopped. The woman looked lost, the kind of lost that had nothing to do with directions. Ethan slowly stopped playing. The last chord faded into the hollow tunnel. He watched her for a moment, uncertain. He had almost nothing left in the world. In the pocket of his coat rested the last $5 he had earned that day. It was supposed to buy him a cheap sandwich and a cup of coffee before the night grew colder. He reached into the pocket anyway. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ethan stepped across the platform toward the crying woman. The fluorescent lights flickered above them, casting pale reflections on the tiled walls. She looked up when she sensed someone near her. Her eyes were red and filled with the kind of exhaustion that comes from a long day of disappointment. Ethan held out the crumpled bill in his hand. $5. The last thing he owned until tomorrow. His voice was calm and gentle. Take this. I know it is not much, but sometimes a small kindness is enough to get through a hard night. The woman stared at the bill as if it were something impossible. You do not even know me, she whispered. Ethan shrugged lightly and smiled with tired warmth. That is exactly why it matters. What Ethan did not know in that quiet moment beneath the roaring trains was that the woman sitting before him was not helpless at all. She was Charlotte Bennett, the chief executive officer of a powerful technology company, walking the city in disguise as part of a secret experiment about human kindness. And the man who had just given away his last $5 had unknowingly changed both of their lives. The train thundered through the tunnel and disappeared into the darkness, leaving a fading echo that rolled across the subway platform like distant waves. Ethan Cole stood quietly for a moment after giving the woman the crumpled $5 bill. He slipped his hands back into the pockets of his worn coat and returned to the concrete pillar where his guitar case rested open on the ground. A few coins rattled softly inside when he lifted the guitar again. The night air beneath the city carried the cold scent of steel rails and old concrete. Ethan sat on the edge of a low-maintenance box and rested the guitar across his knee. His fingers hovered above the strings before slowly beginning another soft melody. The music drifted through the station like a gentle conversation that only the tired walls seemed willing to hear. Across the platform, Charlotte Bennett remained seated on the metal bench, still holding the $5 bill in her hand. Her eyes followed the quiet musician who had just walked away without expecting anything in return. People passed between them again, commuters with heavy coats and distracted expressions. None of them noticed the moment that had just taken place. Charlotte lowered her head slightly as if studying the worn edges of the bill. In her world, $5 meant almost nothing. Yet in that moment, it carried more weight than many business deals she had closed in towering glass offices. She slowly stood and walked toward the exit staircase, but before leaving, she turned once more toward the sound of the guitar. Ethan had already closed his eyes while playing, letting the melody guide him somewhere far away from the cold station. To most people, he was invisible, but Charlotte now saw something different. She saw a man who had almost nothing and still chose kindness. Above the station, the streets of Manhattan were alive with late evening traffic. Charlotte climbed the subway stairs and stepped into the glow of streetlights and passing taxis. A sleek black car waited quietly along the curb. The driver stepped forward and opened the door with respectful calm. "Good evening, Miss Bennet," he said. Charlotte nodded slightly and entered the warm interior of the car. The door closed softly behind her, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb, blending into the steady flow of traffic moving through the city. For several minutes, Charlotte said nothing. The city lights reflected across the window beside her as the car moved through the avenues. Finally, she spoke in a calm, thoughtful voice. "Did you see the man with the guitar down there tonight?" The driver nodded through the rear-view mirror. "Yes, Miss Bennet. Our team noticed him earlier as well." Charlotte rested the $5 bill carefully against her palm. "Make sure the research team reviews the subway security cameras from tonight. I want to know everything about him." The driver gave a small, respectful nod. "Yes, Miss Bennet." Meanwhile, deep beneath the city, Ethan finished another song and lowered his guitar. A few people tossed coins into the case as they hurried past the platform. He smiled politely to each of them before packing the guitar back into its faded case. The station was growing quieter now as the late night hours approached. Ethan closed the case and slung the strap across his shoulder. The $5 he had given away would have bought him a small meal tonight, but strangely he did not feel regret. Instead, he felt a quiet warmth that stayed with him as he walked down the empty corridor toward the far end of the station where a maintenance door led to a sheltered corner he often used to rest. Somewhere above, the streets continued their restless rhythm, and somewhere across the city, Charlotte Bennet watched the skyline pass her window while thinking about the man who had unknowingly changed the direction of her experiment. Hesitation. Daniel spoke carefully. "According to the analysis, he had no idea who you were. He gave you the money willingly, even though it appears to be the last cash he had." Charlotte studied the screen quietly. "Run the background search." Daniel nodded again and swiped to the next file. "His name is Ethan Cole, age 38, born in Nashville, Tennessee. Former studio session guitarist who moved to New York about 10 years ago." Charlotte listened without speaking. Daniel continued reading from a file. 5 years ago, his wife passed away after a long illness. Medical expenses forced him to sell their apartment and most of his equipment. After that, his music work slowly disappeared. Within 2 years, he was sleeping in shelters and eventually on the street. Charlotte lowered her eyes slightly as the information settled in. The quiet musician from the subway had once lived a completely different life. Daniel looked at her again. "Our analysts also confirmed something interesting. In the past 3 months, he has shared money or food with at least 4 other homeless individuals, according to shelter volunteers in that district." Charlotte slowly folded the $5 bill between her fingers. "He keeps giving even when he has nothing left." Daniel nodded. "That appears to be the pattern." Charlotte walked toward the tall window overlooking the city skyline. Far below, millions of people were already rushing through the streets, chasing their own worries and ambitions. Yet somewhere beneath those streets, a quiet man with a guitar was likely waking up on a cold concrete floor. She spoke softly but firmly. "Schedule a visit to the subway station tonight." Daniel looked slightly surprised. "You want to meet him again?" Charlotte nodded while still looking out over the city. "Not as a chief executive officer. Not yet. I want to see if his kindness was real or if last night was only a single moment." Daniel studied her expression and then nodded. "Understood. I will arrange everything quietly." Charlotte turned away from the window and slipped the folded bill carefully into the inside pocket of her coat. For the first time since beginning her hidden study of human kindness, she felt something different growing inside her curiosity mixed with respect. Somewhere beneath the streets of New York, Ethan Cole had no idea that the small act he had performed with a single $5 bill had just captured the full attention of one of the most powerful women in the city. The sun had already begun to sink behind the tall buildings of Manhattan when Ethan Cole slowly opened his eyes. The distant roar of traffic echoed through the subway tunnels as the evening rush hour approached. He sat up from the quiet corner near the maintenance corridor where he had rested during the day. The concrete floor was cold beneath him, but he had grown used to it over the past few years. Ethan stretched his shoulders and reached for the worn guitar case beside him. The instrument inside was old, but carefully maintained. It was the one possession he protected more than anything else. He opened the case and gently lifted the guitar into the dim yellow light of the tunnel. His fingers brushed across the strings, checking the tuning with practiced precision. The sound vibrated softly through the empty hallway. Above him, the city was already filling with millions of footsteps, but down here the underground world moved to its own rhythm. Ethan stood and walked back toward the platform where he usually played in the evenings. The familiar concrete pillar was still there, scarred by decades of passing commuters. He sat down beside it and placed the guitar case open in front of him once again. The first train of the evening arrived with a thunderous rush of wind that swept dust along the platform. When the doors opened, people stepped out quickly, their faces tired after long workdays. Ethan began to play a quiet melody that drifted gently through the noise of the station. The notes were soft but steady, carrying the warmth of someone who understood loneliness better than most. Some commuters slowed their pace for a moment. A few dropped coins into the guitar case before continuing on their way. Ethan nodded politely to each one, grateful but never expecting much. Meanwhile, several blocks away, a familiar black car rolled slowly toward the same subway entrance. Charlotte Bennett sat quietly in the back seat, watching the evening crowds moving along the sidewalks. Her driver guided the vehicle into a side street before stopping near the subway stairs. Charlotte stepped out wearing the same modest coat she had worn the night before. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be just another tired New Yorker returning home after work. Them like a calm conversation without words. Already have something to stand on. When you lose that foundation, it becomes harder to climb back up. Charlotte understood those words more deeply than he realized. Bring the audience whether they want to listen or not. Charlotte watched the quiet confidence in his expression. There was no embarrassment in the way he described his situation. Only a simple acceptance of the life he had learned to live. She took a slow breath before speaking again. If someone offered you a chance to play somewhere better, would you take it? Ethan looked slightly curious. Somewhere better. Charlotte nodded. Maybe a small cafe or a community music program. Somewhere people actually sit down and listen. Ethan gave a soft, thoughtful laugh and leaned back against the concrete pillar. That sounds nice, but life rarely works like that. Places like that usually want musicians with fresh reputations and polished equipment. He tapped the side of the old guitar lightly. This one has seen too many winters. Charlotte noticed the gentle affection in the way he touched the instrument. You still play beautifully, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her with mild surprise before shrugging again. Playing is easy. Starting over is the hard part. Charlotte felt the weight of those words settle in her thoughts. She had spent years building companies and analyzing human behavior, but the challenge Ethan described was something many people in the city quietly faced every day. She reached into her coat pocket and briefly touched the folded $5 bill he had given her. The simple piece of paper felt strangely important now. She leaned forward slightly and spoke with calm sincerity. I know a small place not far from here. They host local music nights a few times each month. Nothing fancy, just people who enjoy listening. Ethan raised one eyebrow with polite curiosity. And why would they want someone like me? Charlotte answered without hesitation. Because someone like you reminded me yesterday that kindness still exists in this city. Ethan studied her expression carefully, trying to understand her meaning. For a moment, the noise of an approaching train filled the tunnel again, shaking the platform beneath their feet. When the sound faded, Charlotte continued in a steady voice. I cannot promise anything yet, but I would like to introduce you to the manager of that place sometime soon. Ethan looked down at the guitar resting across his lap. He seemed thoughtful but cautious. Opportunities had come and disappeared before in his life. Finally, he gave a slow nod. I suppose meeting someone cannot hurt. Charlotte smiled softly, though Ethan could not see the deeper meaning behind her expression. To him, she was simply a woman who had returned to listen to his music and offer a small possibility. But to Charlotte Bennett, the quiet guitarist sitting beside the concrete pillar had just become the center of a much larger plan. Her experiment had been designed to measure kindness. Now, it was slowly transforming into something far more personal. And Ethan Cole still had no idea that the woman offering him a chance to play beyond the subway tunnels was one of the most powerful business leaders in the entire city. The train pulled away from the platform with a long metallic roar, leaving the station wrapped in a quieter kind of night. Ethan Cole rested his guitar across his knee and watched the last few passengers disappear up the stairs. The station lights flickered slightly above the concrete pillar where he had played for years. Charlotte Bennett remained seated on the bench across from him, her eyes thoughtful as she studied the calm expression on his face. For a long moment, she said nothing. The conversation about the small cafe still lingered between them, but Charlotte knew something important had to happen next. Ethan deserved honesty, or at least the beginning of it. Ethan finally broke the silence with a small smile. You know, most people who stop down here for music do not come back a second night. Charlotte returned the smile gently. I suppose most people never hear a song they remember. Ethan chuckled quietly and looked down at his guitar strings. Well, if you keep coming back, I will have to learn some new songs. Charlotte took a slow breath. The moment she had been carefully planning had arrived sooner than expected. She reached into her coat pocket and removed a small card. The simple white rectangle looked ordinary at first glance. She stood from the bench and walked closer to Ethan. He noticed the movement and raised his head slightly. Charlotte held the card out to him. You asked why a place would want someone like you to play there, she said calmly. Maybe it is easier if I explain who I really am. Ethan accepted the card with a puzzled expression. He turned it over in the dim station light and read the printed letters. Charlotte Bennett, Chief Executive Officer, Bennett Technologies. Ethan stared at the card for several seconds, as if he expected the words to change. Finally, he looked up at her with clear disbelief. That is a joke, right? Charlotte shook her head slowly. No joke. Ethan let out a quiet laugh that carried equal parts confusion and disbelief. You mean to tell me the woman sitting on that bench, crying last night, runs one of the biggest technology companies in the city? Charlotte met his gaze steadily. Yes. Ethan leaned back against the pillar and studied her face more carefully now. The tired coat and quiet posture suddenly seemed different to him. Why would someone like you pretend to be lost in a subway station? Charlotte hesitated for a moment before answering. For the past year, my company has been studying how people respond to kindness. I wanted to see what strangers would do if they believed someone nearby needed help. Ethan lowered the business card slowly. And I suppose I passed the test. Charlotte stepped closer, her voice softer now. You did more than that. You gave away the last $5 you had without asking for anything in return. Ethan looked down at the guitar resting across his lap. He did not seem proud or impressed with himself. It was just $5. Charlotte shook her head gently. It was not just money. It was proof that kindness still exists when no one is watching. Ethan studied her quietly, trying to understand the strange turn their conversation had taken. The rumble of another train echoed through the tunnel behind them, but neither of them moved. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been forming in his mind since she revealed the card. So what happens now? Charlotte smiled faintly and folded her hands together. Now I would like to make you a real offer. Not an experiment, not a test, a real opportunity. Ethan raised an eyebrow with cautious curiosity. Charlotte continued, speaking with calm sincerity. Tomorrow evening, my company is hosting a small event at one of our community art spaces. I would like you to come and play music there. Ethan stared at her as the meaning of her words slowly settled in. The underground guitarist who had spent years playing beside a concrete pillar suddenly found himself standing at the edge of a door he never expected to. See again. And for the first time since his life had fallen apart years earlier, Ethan Cole realized that something extraordinary might be beginning beneath the quiet lights of the subway station. The rumble of the departing train slowly faded into the distance, leaving the underground station wrapped in a strange quiet that neither Ethan Cole nor Charlotte Bennett seemed ready to break. Ethan still held the business card loosely between his fingers. The small white rectangle felt heavier than it should have, as if the printed letters carried the weight of an entirely different world. Charlotte Bennett, Chief Executive Officer, Bennett Technologies. Ethan looked from the card back to her face again, studying her with new attention. The woman standing in front of him no longer appeared like a stranger lost in the subway. Now he saw someone composed, confident, and strangely determined. "You're serious about this invitation," he finally said. Charlotte nodded calmly. "Completely serious." Ethan shifted his guitar slightly across his lap and gave a quiet breath. "I have not played on a real stage in years." Charlotte folded her arms gently and leaned against the metal railing near the platform wall. Sometimes the world just needs someone willing to start again. Ethan studied the floor for a moment before speaking again. "And what exactly would I be walking into tomorrow night?" Charlotte answered with careful honesty. "It is a small community arts event sponsored by my company. We host it in a renovated music space downtown where local artists perform. Nothing too formal. Mostly people who enjoy music and creativity." Ethan considered her words carefully. The idea of standing in front of an audience again stirred memories he had tried to bury long ago. The last time he had performed on a real stage, his wife had still been alive, sitting in the front row, smiling proudly while he played. The thought passed quietly through his mind like an old photograph drifting through a forgotten room. Charlotte seemed to notice the distant look in his eyes. "You do not have to decide tonight," she said gently. Ethan slowly shook his head. "No. If I say no now, I might regret it for the rest of my life." Charlotte smiled slightly, relieved but also impressed by the courage behind his answer. "Good. Then we should plan a few things before tomorrow evening." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Plan?" Charlotte nodded and spoke in a practical tone. "First, we need to get you ready for a stage again." Ethan glanced down at his worn coat and old boots. "I imagine this outfit might not fit the event very well." Charlotte allowed herself a small laugh. "Probably not, but that can be fixed." Ethan looked uncertain again. "I do not have any money for clothes or transportation." Charlotte met his concern with calm reassurance. "That will not be your problem. My team will handle the arrangements." Ethan stared at her for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of someone else paying for things he could not afford. Charlotte noticed his hesitation and spoke carefully. "This is not charity, Ethan. You are being invited as a musician. Consider it an advance for the performance." Ethan slowly nodded. That explanation seemed easier for him to accept. Above them, another train thundered through the tunnel, shaking the platform briefly before disappearing again into darkness. Charlotte stepped back toward the stairs leading out of the station. "I will send a car here tomorrow afternoon to pick you up. It will bring you to the music space so you can see the stage before the event begins." Ethan stood up with his guitar case and slung the strap over his shoulder. "A car. That is going to surprise a few people down here." Charlotte smiled softly as she turned toward the steps. Sometimes surprises are the beginning of better chapters. Ethan watched her climb the subway stairs until she disappeared into the city lights above. The station grew quiet again, but something inside Ethan had shifted. For years, the concrete pillar and the passing trains had been the only audience he expected. Now a door had opened that he never imagined would appear again. And as he walked slowly back toward his small sleeping corner deep in the tunnels, Ethan Cole realized that the next evening might be the first step back into the life he thought he had lost forever. The following afternoon arrived with a pale gray sky stretching over Manhattan as Ethan Cole sat quietly on the steps near the subway entrance, his guitar case resting beside him. He had barely slept the night before. The idea of standing on a real stage again had stirred memories he had not allowed himself to revisit for years. Musicians walking into studios, the glow of stage lights, applause from strangers who had come only to listen. For a long time, those memories had felt like fragments from another life. Now, they waited just ahead of him like a door he was not entirely certain he deserved to walk through. People passed by without noticing him as they hurried down into the station. A few recognized him as the guitarist who usually played beside the concrete pillar underground. One older man paused briefly. "You're not playing today." Ethan smiled politely. "Not today." The man nodded and continued walking. Ethan looked down at the guitar case again, running his fingers along the worn edges. For years, this instrument had been the only constant thing in his life. It had survived rain, cold nights, and countless hours inside the echoing subway tunnels. Today, it would be carried somewhere entirely different. A low hum of traffic moved through the street above as a sleek black car slowly turned the corner and stopped near the curb. Ethan noticed it immediately. The driver stepped out and approached him with a respectful nod. "Mr. Cole." Ethan stood slowly, unsure how to respond to being addressed so formally. "Yes." The driver opened the back door of the car. "Miss Bennett asked me to bring you to the venue." Ethan hesitated for a moment. The polished vehicle looked completely out of place beside the worn steps where he had spent so many afternoons resting between songs. Finally, he lifted the guitar case and stepped inside. The door closed quietly, and the car began moving through the streets of the city. Ethan watched through the window as Manhattan passed by. Tall buildings reflected the afternoon light, while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks below. The ride felt strangely silent. For years, his world had been limited to a few city blocks and the underground station where he played music. Now, he was crossing neighborhoods he had not seen in a very long time. After several minutes, the car turned onto a quiet street lined with renovated brick buildings. It stopped in front of a small art center with tall windows and warm lights glowing inside. Ethan stepped out slowly and looked up at the sign above the entrance. The place felt inviting but unfamiliar, like a forgotten dream returning to life. Inside the building, Charlotte Bennett stood near the stage, speaking quietly with a few members of her event team. When she saw Ethan walk through the door, she greeted him with a warm smile. "You made it." Ethan nodded and glanced around the room. The space was simple but beautiful. Wooden floors stretched across the open hall, and soft lights hung above a small stage at the front of the room. Several chairs were arranged neatly in rows facing the platform. "This is where the event will happen tonight," Charlotte explained. Ethan walked slowly toward the stage, each step carrying a mixture of excitement and hesitation. He placed the guitar case down and looked up at the empty lights above him. It had been years since he had stood somewhere like this. Charlotte watched him quietly. She could see the memories moving across his face as he absorbed the moment. Then a staff member approached Charlotte, holding a tablet with a concerned expression. Charlotte read the message on the screen, and her expression changed slightly. A local media blogger had somehow discovered information about the upcoming performance. The article was already spreading online. The headline suggested that a wealthy technology executive was turning a homeless musician into a publicity stunt for attention. Charlotte lowered the tablet slowly. Ethan had not seen the message yet. He stood at the edge of the stage, tuning his guitar carefully, unaware that outside the walls of the arts center, the story of his sudden appearance was already beginning to attract attention across the city. The quiet rehearsal inside the small arts center slowly gave way to the growing murmur of people arriving for the evening event. Outside the tall windows, the lights of Manhattan had begun to glow as night settled over the city. Inside the room, Ethan Cole sat on the edge of the stage, carefully tuning his guitar, unaware of the tension that had begun spreading quietly through Charlotte Bennett's team. Charlotte stood near the back of the room, holding the tablet that her assistant had handed her only minutes earlier. The article on the screen continued to spread across social media platforms. The headline suggested that a powerful technology executive had staged a dramatic rescue of a homeless musician to create a viral publicity story. Charlotte read the words again with a calm expression, but the message beneath them was clear. Someone wanted to turn the evening into a scandal. Her assistant, Daniel Mercer, spoke in a low voice beside her. The article is spreading quickly. Some reporters are already asking questions about whether the performance tonight is part of a marketing campaign. Charlotte lowered the tablet slowly. That is not surprising. People often believe the worst version of a story before they look for the truth. Across the room, Ethan began testing a soft melody, the familiar notes filling the warm space as guests continued entering the hall. Several people paused to listen even before the event officially started. Charlotte watched him quietly. The last thing she wanted was for the negative story to reach Ethan before he had the chance to perform. But the modern world moved quickly. Within minutes, one of the event volunteers approached, Ethan holding a phone. "Mr. Cole," the volunteer said carefully, "you might want to see this." Ethan accepted the phone with a puzzled expression. The article appeared on the screen with a bold headline suggesting that a wealthy business leader had selected a homeless musician as part of a carefully designed public relations experiment. Ethan read the first few lines slowly. His expression changed as the meaning settled in. When he finished reading, he lowered the phone and looked across the room toward Charlotte. The warmth that had filled the space only moments earlier seemed to fade slightly. Charlotte walked toward him calmly, understanding that the moment could not be avoided any longer. Ethan spoke first, his voice quiet but steady. "Is that what this is?" Charlotte stopped a few steps away. "What do you mean?" Ethan lifted the phone slightly. "This story. It says I am part of some kind of publicity project." Charlotte answered honestly. "The article is wrong." Ethan studied her carefully. "But the part about the experiment is true, is it not?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, I did begin by studying how strangers respond to kindness." Ethan looked down at the guitar resting across his lap. The room around them had grown silent, as several guests quietly sensed the tension forming. "So I was part of a study after all," Ethan said. Charlotte spoke gently. "You were never subject to me. The moment you helped me in the subway, everything changed." Ethan gave a small, thoughtful breath. "Maybe that is true for you. But to the rest of the world, it looks like I am just a story for your company to promote." Charlotte stepped closer. "That was never my intention." Ethan closed the guitar case slowly. "I know you probably meant well, but I have spent years trying to rebuild some dignity after losing everything. I cannot stand on a stage tonight wondering whether the audience believes I am real or just another marketing idea." Charlotte watched him carefully, knowing his words came from a place of quiet pride rather than anger. Ethan lifted the guitar case and stepped down from the stage. "I appreciate the opportunity you offered," he said calmly, "but I think it is better if I leave before this becomes something else entirely." Charlotte did not try to stop him as he walked toward the exit. The room remained silent as the door closed behind him, and the sound of the city returned through the glass windows. In that moment, Charlotte Bennett realized that the story she had hoped to create about kindness had just slipped completely out of her control. The door of the small art center closed behind Ethan Cole, and the quiet click echoed through the hallway, like the final note of a song that had ended too soon. Outside, the night air of Manhattan felt colder than before. Ethan stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his guitar case hanging from his shoulder, watching the lights of the city reflect across the wet pavement. Cars moved past in steady streams while people hurried along the sidewalks. Unaware that only minutes earlier he had been standing on a stage he once believed might change his life again. Ethan let out a slow breath and began walking without choosing a direction. The familiar streets gradually led him back toward the part of the city he understood best. Downward staircases, concrete tunnels, the echo of trains beneath the ground. Meanwhile, inside the art center, Charlotte Bennett remained standing near the empty stage. The room was filled with uneasy silence. Guests whispered quietly among themselves while members of her staff waited for instructions. Charlotte looked toward the door, where Ethan had disappeared only moments earlier. She understood exactly why he had left. To Ethan, the story spreading online had turned a moment of kindness into something that looked like a performance arranged by powerful people. Daniel Mercer approached her carefully. "The media article is still spreading. Several reporters are asking for a response from the company." Charlotte took a slow breath before answering. "Then they will receive one." She reached out and handed the tablet back to Daniel. "Contact every reporter who has requested information and tell them I will make a statement tonight." Daniel looked surprised. "Tonight?" Charlotte nodded firmly. "Yes. The truth should move as quickly as the rumor." Less than an hour later, Charlotte stood in front of several cameras inside a small press room prepared by her team. The same article that had created suspicion was now being discussed across news channels and social media accounts throughout the city. Charlotte looked directly into the cameras with calm determination. "I want to clarify something that has been misunderstood," she began. "Several months ago, I started a personal study about how people respond to strangers who appear to need help. Last night in a subway station, I met a man named Ethan Cole. He did not know who I was. He did not know I was conducting any kind of study. When he saw someone crying on a bench, he offered the last $5 he had in his pocket. Charlotte paused for a moment before continuing. I did not ask him for help. I did not promise him anything in return. He acted purely out of kindness when he believed no one was watching. That moment was recorded by public subway security cameras, and with his permission, those recordings will be released so people can see exactly what happened. The room grew quiet as reporters listened carefully. Charlotte continued speaking in a steady voice. Ethan Cole was never part of a publicity campaign. He was never hired as a marketing idea. He is simply a musician who showed more humanity in a single moment than many people demonstrate in a lifetime. She finished her statement and stepped away from the cameras. Within minutes, the security footage from the subway station began circulating online. The video showed Ethan quietly stopping his music, walking toward a crying stranger, and offering the small $5 bill without hesitation. Across the city, people began sharing the clip. What had started as suspicion slowly turned into something different. Respect, compassion, and curiosity about the quiet guitarist who had never expected the world to notice him at all. But deep beneath the streets, Ethan Cole had already returned to the place.